The next speaker is Ahmed Naji. Ahmed Naji is a researcher. He has been following what's happening in Yemen generally and Al-Mahrah in particular. Ahmed, I will ask you to start with your talk straight away. Sorry about that. I lost my introduction.
No, it's totally fine. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invite. It's my pleasure to be with you today. Within my 10 minutes, I will try to do my best to just speak about several points related to Mahra and the situation there. So just before I start, I have to clarify some points related to Mahra and how we can understand the situation there. The first one, we should distinguish between Mahra and Mahri tribes. Always we hear about Mahra Governorate, and it's just the Yemeni Governorate, which is close to the Omani border. But when it comes to Mahri tribes, they are beyond this geographical location. They are a kind of ecosystem. They are existing in many areas, either in Oman, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. And on the other side, they are in some parts of the Horn of Africa. And the second point related to the historical relationship between Mahra and Socotra Island. And we have seen actually so many links between the two areas. And people actually got confused about why Mahra and Socotra, because both of them actually, they were under the Sultanate of Al-Afrar, which was disintegrated in 1967. And until now, they have both. They have their unique identity and they have their own local language. In Mahra, they have Mahris, and Socotra, they have Socotri language. The second point related to the why the situation in Mahra today is filled with so many regional actors, and the answer simply because of the disintegration of the central government and the huge vacuum created because of that. And we have seen actually many regional actors taking place because of this matter. The third point related to the economic and security interest of the regional actors. Today, Oman is looking at Mahra as the first belt of its defense, because Omanis actually have in their minds the memory of the Dhofar rebellion, which was between 1965 to 1975. And they don't want to see any sort of instability near to their borders. So that's why they try to maintain the situation in Mahra and try to not bring any regional actors or to leave it alone for any sort of regional actors, either Saudi Arabia or Emiratis. And another dynamic related to the economic interest, we have seen actually previously some news talking about the pipeline that Saudi Arabia is trying to build in Mahra, and this is not something new. Actually, they started talking about this matter in 80s, 90s, and they are actually reviving this kind of interest. For the economic dynamics in Mahra, before the conflict, actually, before 2015, most of the Mahri tribes or Mahri population, actually, they were actually counting on fishing industry, animal husbandry, or some trade activities between Oman and Yemen, or on the other side between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Giving the closure of closure of their areas to these surrounding actually places. But when the blockade came in 2015 as a result of the military operations of the Saudi-led coalition, Mahra actually started witnessing new economic dynamics because while the air, land crossings and ports were closed on the other side, it was the only actually place which witnessed sort of good movements, trade movements, was the crossing of Shihin in Al-Mahrah. And as a result, actually, we have seen in Mahra many actually economic movements in these areas. The second point actually related to the economic dynamics in Mahra is the relative stability, because as we know, Mahra is far east and it's far away from all the military fronts, either in south or north. So many people actually went to Mahra to start their businesses. There was a sort of relative stability. And the third point related to the economic dynamics, which I call it unhealthy economy, which is related to the war economy, because when Saudi Arabia actually arrived to Al-Mahrah in November 2017, they started actually counting on some tribes, and they recruited actually large number of tribesmen. Some reports talking about 14,000 Mahris who receive actually salary on monthly basis from Saudi Arabia. And this actually made a sort of economic growth for some people in Mahra. And this is actually one of the, as I mentioned, war economy or war dynamics. The fourth point related to the economic situation related to smuggling activities, because Saudi Arabia today is saying that they are in Mahra to counter smuggling activities. And I think a part of this claim is true, but it's not specifically in Mahra, because if you look at the coastal line of the southern part of Yemen, you will find actually long coastal line. It's around 1,100 actually kilometers, and 560 kilometers actually a part of Al-Mahrah. And the smuggling activities is not just in Al-Mahrah, actually they are in Al-Mahrah, in Hadramaut, in Shabwa, in Abiyan, in Aden. And it's hard actually to secure this kind of coastal line. But again, since there are lots of interest in Al-Mahrah, we have seen this kind of competition. I will end with a research actually I did last year. It was about why the situation in Al-Mahrah is relatively peaceful, and it's not like the other areas in the country. And I think this is related to what I name it code of conduct of Mahri tribes, because if we look at the situation since November 2017, few actually lethal incidents happened in Al-Mahrah, despite the intensive competition between regional and local actors. And the reason behind that is the tribal dynamics, or what I always name it, the conflict resolution mechanisms embedded in the culture of Mahri tribes. So there are actually 5 key dynamics related to the tribal conflict resolutions mechanisms in Al-Mahrah. The first one is that when an outside player engages in any direct aggression against a Mahri tribe or individuals, most Mahri, irrespective of tribal affiliation, tend to close ranks against the outsider. And we have seen actually some incidents which prove this dynamic. And the second in this code of conduct is among the Mahris, blood is thicker than water. We have seen, for instance, in Al-Anfaq incidents, which happened in 2018, some people actually were in the line of the former governor, Rajah Bakret, who was supported by by Saudis. And when his forces actually, or his aligned local authority, committed violations against the protesters, some tribes who were in his line actually went on the other side because this is something huge in their view. And the third point in this code of conduct is that bearing arms in Mahra doesn't necessarily mean they are trying to use them. They just bear arms in order to show that they are preferring actually peace agreements, but they are ready if the situation goes to conflict or any sort of hard situation. And the fourth point in the Mahri conduct, code of conduct is that when armed conflict between Mahri tribes does occur, the spoils don't go to the victor. And this is something very important. And the last thing, and this is what I noticed in many areas in Mahra, there is very active internal mediation. So wherever actually there's any sort of conflict or clashes, the Mahri tribes try to resolve it as soon as possible. And this is actually can be seen in the other areas in Yemen, but not as active as it is in Mahra. And I think because of this kind of dynamics, the situation in Mahra seems to be less violent and relatively peaceful. And that's why so many people in Yemen went to Mahra. We are talking about 250,000 of Yemenis who are now in Mahra, who went to Mahra after 2015 because of all these kind of dynamics. I will stop here, and if you have any kind of question, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insight presentation. Thank you very much. The question and answer will be later on. Without any further ado, I think I will do the same for Elana De Lozier to do her presentation without reading furthermore. Elana, over to you.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about, so what I've been asked to talk about is the international aspects of Mahra, which the previous speakers have spoken a little bit about, so I won't repeat a lot of what they said, but some of it crosses over. So the first thing that I want to say is that the two main actors to care about with regard to Mahra is Saudi Arabia and then Oman. The UAE had was in Al-Mahrah for a short time trying to create an elite force. That didn't really go that well. And then the Saudis came in. So, there was a UAE part of the story at some point, but we're a little bit past that. And of course, the UAE is still in South Yemen running counterterrorism operations, and that may bleed into Mahra on occasion, just in the same way that the STC role does. But broadly speaking, the UAE story is not intertwined with Mahra as much as obviously the Saudis and the Omanis. So to begin with the Saudis, so I'm going to repeat a couple of things that some folks said as just an effort to frame the situation. But I think one of the things that Ahmed mentioned and Saeed as well is the connection back to history. And maybe not to put you on the spot, Noel, but maybe Noel can talk about this a little bit, in the sense that 1967 was a really big year for all of South Yemen. This was when the British pulled out, and I'm simplifying history a little bit, but the British pulled out and the communists came in. And there was a very violent couple of years in certain parts of South Yemen, and the Mahris and the Socotres remember this quite distinctly because it affected them in particular, and affected the leadership of the Sultanate and that sort of thing. And so that, coupled with the Dhofari War, as Ahmed mentioned, I think there's a real fear of going back to that time of instability and specifically of violence. And so I think that that's a common thread that runs through, conversations about Mahra with Mahris. And I just think it's something important for the audience to keep in mind. So bringing ourselves up to modern day, the Saudi role in Mahra, so as others have mentioned, the Saudis came in a couple of years ago and they entered under their reasoning was to combat smuggling. So not only have the Saudis suggested they're smuggling over the border, but it seems as though some other coalition countries think that that's also been the case. The question is always whether the Omanis know about it or not, less that there's, the Omanis contest it. The Omanis say we have not allowed smuggling over the border. The Saudis and some other coalition countries think that there has been smuggling over the border, but not necessarily that the Omanis have know that, right? So whether the Omanis are complicit or not is the question. And the UN panel has written some things about smuggling, suggesting that Oman is used as a waypoint essentially, but so is the long coastline along the Gulf of Aden and the south of Yemen. So, you know, there's still there's a lack of clarity on this, right? Like all of us try to get at this issue of, is there smuggling, isn't there smuggling? And what specifically they're worried about is Iran using the border to smuggle missile components to the Houthis. Now, Iran tends to use Houdaiport for most stuff, but allegedly there's been some materials that came over the Omani border. And what I can tell you is that when the Saudis first came into Mahra, about a couple months after that, about 6 months after that, the Houthis sort of ran out of their best missiles at the time. And for a good while after that, they were sending about 1 missile a month, and then suddenly that just stopped, which would suggest that their supply got interrupted. Now, I can't prove that's because the Saudis came into Mahra. I'm not making that. I'm suggesting that these things lined up time-wise, but we can't ever say for sure what really happened there. And then at some point, the Houthis started to get missiles again. And so, you know, even if the Saudis were able to cut off smuggling at some point, the smuggling has resumed. And we all know that the Houthis are regularly sending missiles towards Riyadh. And so even if the Saudi force came in for smuggling purposes, they aren't able to do as much counter smuggling as they would like. And that really, I can imagine that frustrates the locals whenever you say you're here for counter smuggling, and yet the Houthis have all these missiles. So like, what are you doing? So I think that's sort of the conversation about smuggling. There's a lot of debate over it. I am somebody who tries to get to the truth, and it's been really hard to get to the truth. The other thing that the Saudis are doing, which Ahmed mentioned and Saeed mentioned, actually I think Saeed mentioned, is the using Mahra as a base for basically experimental reconstruction. The Saudis, the Saudi Reconstruction Fund, which is run by the ambassador to Yemen, Ahmed Al-Jaber, does most of their projects in Mahra, or does every type of project that they have, at least one version of it in Mahra. And I agree that it seems weird to do it there when there's no war. Now, the way it's been explained to me is we're testing these ideas in places that are a little bit safer so that we can deploy them elsewhere. But we haven't seen that pattern of sort of testing here, it works, and then we deploy it elsewhere. So this is something somebody should, you know, be looking into in more detail, is, you know, tracking down that narrative and whether that's actually, if we're seeing, you know, Mahra actually being an experiment, or whether the work's just being done in Mahra. I was really surprised. I'm constantly really surprised by how many projects are happening in Mahra under the Saudi Reconstruction Fund. It does seem a little bit strange. Then there's the accusations of Salafi schools cropping up in Mahra. So the accusation, and I want to be really clear, the accusation is that a bunch of the folks that used to be part of the Dar al-Hadith schools in the north, such as the Damaj Institute, you know, had to flee because of the Houthi drive towards Sana'a in 2014. And a lot of those folks have now ended up in Mahra, feeling as though they have Saudi protection in order to restart schools there of the Dar al-Hadith brand, and that the locals are very upset with this. That's the accusation, that's the narrative. I have had a really hard time tracking down what's true and what isn't. And so I saw a question in the Q&A about this, I leave it to the Mahris to kind of get to the bottom of whether there is a school in Kishan and what that school is doing and whether it's who it's funded by and all of those kinds of questions. Those have been very hard to answer, and believe me, I've tried. And then the other point about Saudi I'll make is that there's an allegation that Saudi's in Mahra because they want a pipeline to the Arabian Sea. And so the thing about Saudi Arabia is that they have contingent access to the open seas. So it's really important for a country to have access to the open seas because that gives them access to global markets. And for Saudi Arabia, you think they're surrounded by water, but they're actually, all of their shipments have to go through the Suez Canal, which is blocked right now because of that ship, if you guys saw the news on that, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. And so they have very contingent access. Their access to the open seas is contingent on these 3 choke points, all of which have their own concerns. And so the idea is Saudi would love to have direct access down, you know, to the Arabian Sea and out to the world. And so they've wanted a pipeline through Yemen or Oman for a long time. And this is actually a true story. The Saudis have wanted access to a pipeline through Yemen and Oman for a long time, and they've requested it at various points in time in history, including in 67. I think they asked Qaboos's father, they asked Qaboos in 70, and they have always been told no, in part because they want sovereignty for the territory for like the mile or 2 on both sides of the pipeline. Now, so then using this historical evidence of them wanting a pipeline, folks are suggesting that, you know, coming into Mahra is part of that plan as well. The Saudis deny this, and so, you know, we can talk about that in the Q&A, but I just wanted to give you sort of the context for where that rumor comes from. Yeah, so that's where that rumor comes from. And then then I'll just make a couple points about Oman and then turn it over. So on Oman doesn't love the Saudi presence. So the Saudis are in Mahra, have been there now for 3 or 4 years, and have a strong military presence there. And it's not totally clear why that's necessary. And so there are locals who are very upset about this. And of course, Saeed went through the various groups with Harazi and crew. The Omanis have a long relationship with many of these locals. In the northern parts of Mahra, so did the Saudis on the border with Saudi. But for the most part, the Mahri relationship is stronger with Oman, and there's a bunch of people with Omani passports, and you know, the Omanis have long seen Dhofar and Mahra as, you know, kind of part of their strategic depth, or whatever you might want to call it. And the Omanis are very uncomfortable with the Saudi presence, but they're not going to raise public heckles about it. And I think that it would be useful if the Saudis and Omanis had a conversation about the smuggling. If the Saudis said, hey, there's smuggling, and, you know, we want you guys to, you know, cut back on that, or if there was some conversation. But my understanding is that I'm not sure those conversations have happened. And I think that the Omanis are sort of waiting this one out. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Elana. This is great, and I hope the question and answer will shed more light into what you have heard so far. And then the final speaker is Noel Brehony. Noel, you have heard what the 3 speakers have said about Al-Mahrah and what you know about Saudi and Saudi presence, and what's the future of being there for how long. Thank you, Noel.
Well, thank you. Well, yes, I'll really be covering some of the same ground as other speakers, but I'll ask specifically to try and see how the Saudis saw it. You know, I think this strikes me particularly if you look at the Saudi deployment in Mahra. It is actually significant, but it is consistent. Can I share my screen? Let me see if I can. Will it work?
Yes, you can share your screen, Noel.
Okay, right. I was share. Okay, yeah. I'll come to that one in a minute. This is a map. This is a extract from a report done by the Sana'a Center, I think it was. Casey Coombs wrote it, but it actually shows that the blue dots are where the Saudis are in Mahra, and you can see it's. I wouldn't look too much at the use of base. These are outposts, but it is significant, and you know, I think it's probably more significant than in any other parts of Yemen in terms of Saudi troop presence. So that is a factor. But I think it's important. It's important to look at how this started. I was involved in late 1917 in some of this, and early 2018. Basically, because I was involved in a project which was looking at trying to work out with Mahris what they might want for the future. I can't talk in any detail about who was there, but it does throw some light on the background to this. What struck me at the time was that the UAE attempts to develop a militia in Mahra had failed, and the relationship between the UAE and Mahra had declined to a point where the UAE left and the Saudis decided to come in. And it was, as others have said, on the basis of a counter-smuggling operation. And I suppose this deployment is could be seen in that light. But at the time, when I was involved in this project, we had a briefing from the person responsible for counter smuggling in Mahra at the time, and he told us what forces he had to deal with smuggling, which were minuscule, a tiny number of people, and all that along coast with coastline and the border of Oman. So there was no effective counter smuggling at the time, and this is all occurring at the time when there's evidence from the panel of experts and other sources of smuggling taking place. So in that sense, there was some evidence for the Saudis to go in as they said that they had. There were problems in the implementation. I think we've seen some of this reflected tonight. I mean, there was initially, I think people were trying to throw their weight around, really trying to do things without Mahris, trying to impose policies. But that, I think, shifted in sort of mid-2018. There was an attempt to work more closely with Mahris and to sort of try and achieve the objectives, both with Mahris and, of course, through the Yemeni government presence, which is there, which is hardly mentioned, but there is a governor of Mahra appointed by Hadi, but very, very clearly influenced by the Saudi situation. And part of that implementation was the creation of those projects which have been discussed. And certainly, as put to me, and I've also met Mohammed Al-Jabal, the Saudi ambassador, and he actually claimed it as a model for what happened elsewhere in a safe place. Now, you know, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that's how it was seen. And also, can I just look at the pipeline issue? Because again, I don't want to keep repeating what other people say, but the pipeline, as to my knowledge, has been 3 attempts to build a pipeline, to talk about a pipeline. The first was actually that I was aware of, at least, was in 1975, when it was done as a good joint Kuwaiti, UAE, Saudi attempt to build a pipeline. It was repeated it was done as a Saudi initiative in 1983, but with that demand that the Saudi should have sovereignty over the pipeline. And it may have been repeated in the just after the unity in 1990. I'm not sure about that. But it's just worth looking at this map here. This is the the current pipelines. But look at that particular east-west pipeline, going from the Saudi oil fields to Yanbu. You know, that is currently being expanded to, I think it's currently at 5 million barrels a day, and it's going up to 7 million barrels a day, which is really, you know, what the Saudi exports. So, potentially that pipeline should, in theory, bypass the Straits of Hormuz. But you know, as Elana said, it doesn't deal with this side, and there has been this idea for some time of being around. But you know, the last time I could find this mentioned was 30 years ago, and I've not seen any strong evidence. I know there was a suspicion that the Saudis may be reviving that project. The other aspect of this, I think, which struck me, is I've been looking at the sort of history of the Saudi-Yemeni border, more on the old Yemen Arab Republic border. And the Saudi border policy was always trying to work, that the border region was almost seen as a separate province where Yemen and Saudi Arabia were working together. This is, I say, as seen from a Saudi perspective. The intention was to try and should we say, incentivize Yemenis on the Yemeni side of the border to support the border and preserve it. That sort of shifted over the years, but it was linked to the Saudi Special Committee for Yemen, which still exists, which was the organization through which all the payments were made in Yemen to tribal and other leaders. And it was a big factor in obviously influencing policy in Yemen. And looking at the longer term, because that's what I was asked to do, you know, where do I think the Saudi's ultimate aim is? My guess is that it will it'll stay in Mahra at least until the war ends, and until there's at least a stable government in Yemen or South Yemen or Mahra, whatever it happens to be. And then I would anticipate that they would really try and revert to the former policy of trying to exercise influence through people who are involved in a patronage system rather than this direct military involvement which you've got currently. I shall stop there.
Thank you very much, Noel. With your maps, probably gave us a little bit of a illustration, you know, what's going there. I think now we will start with the Q&A, and there are a number of questions.